Exactly 2 minutes past the top of the hour. You're right in time for our first conversation this Wednesday morning. Our focus centered on just looking at some of those policy gaps that exist when it comes to enhancing delivery of infrastructure projects. Oftentimes you've talked about how there's a disconnect between what's on paper in terms of policies and actually implementing them. And that is what you're set to converse in the next 50 minutes or so with my guests who are here on set to help us expand more on that particular issue. To my extreme left, that is Engineer Peter Wanday, who is the former chairman ACEK. He'll be telling us, what this stands for. And right next to him is Engineer Professor Silvester Abuodha, who is the consulting engineer EBK, that is the Engineers Board of Kenya. Karibu sana to the program, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Doreen.
Perhaps we can just start from understanding what ACEK is and what its mandate is before we get further to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. ACEK stands for the Association of Consulting Engineers of Kenya. And this is a body that was established in 1968, and it brings together consulting engineers who are practicing engineering in this country. It is kind of not really a welfare group, but it's a body that propagates the interest of practicing engineers. So it's a link between the practitioners and policymakers and other stakeholders. Yeah.
So it's a link between the two, which is actually what you're trying to just understand at this point, what normally happens and what is the missing link. But let me come to you, Prof. While I was preparing for this interview, I actually came across the fact that we have two categories of infrastructure, which is sort of found to be a new term. And I just want to believe that it's not one of those things that we would even think about when you think about infrastructure. I found out that we have what we call the, the hard and soft kind of infrastructure. Is this one of those things that happen when it comes to infrastructure, and what exactly are this?
Thank you very much for having me. Hard infrastructure are the things that they actually put on the ground. So, for example, the road, the building, a water project, that's a hard infrastructure. Soft infrastructure will be things like telecommunications, where you're not really seeing the asset itself, but it's there and it's being used for connectivity. So that's where the difference is between the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. Yeah.
So actually that exists there. We have what you call hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure.
That's true.
All right. Well said. Now, Engineer Peter, of course, infrastructural programs and projects, they focus on quite a number of things. We have system, we have how it's being implemented, we have services, and we can go on and on. But obviously we know that there's something very key when it comes to infrastructure. And of course we'll come to those gaps momentarily as we continue this conversation. But just talk to me about the issue of funding when it comes to infrastructure and what modes of funding exist in respect to this kind of development.
Yeah, infrastructure development, as you know, is very capital intensive because financing road development, ports and railways and dams and telecommunication facilities, all these things is not cheap at all. And the largest spender in infrastructure development is really the government. The government relies on different kinds of sources of financing to achieve or to implement these developments. So you've got exchequer financing, whereby the National Treasury allocates funds from, collected from the taxpayers of this country and are channeled towards financing such projects. You have also donor support or development partner support. So we have development partners like the World Bank, for example, the African Development Bank, European Union, and other bilateral funding agencies, the French Development Corporation, for instance, Japan International Cooperation Agency, who also chip in and assist our government with funding. These are long-term loans. Usually you've got Chinese also who are funding lots of projects in this country. So it's really a conglomeration between development partner financing and exchequer financing. Yeah.
So then can this be categorized into private kind of company financing as well as public kind of company financing?
Well, the private sector financing is somehow different. These are PPP projects, public, private-public partnerships. Yeah. But I'm talking really of the traditional way of funding infrastructure was whereby you use taxpayers' money to fund projects, and development partners also lend this country money. Sometimes it's also grants. But we are seeing a big shift now towards PPP projects, whereby private funds are being marshaled to finance projects. And the private entities are then able to recover their financing or their contribution over an extended period of time. It could be through direct tolling, for example. The Nairobi Expressway is a good example of that, whereby a private entity has put up this massive infrastructure and is collecting revenues directly from the public to recoup back what they have spent on financing this infrastructure. So that's another model of financing.
Oh, well said.
It is gaining a lot of strength.
Yeah. And we'll come to that in a bit, just to understand more of what PPP is, because you've seen a lot of that, particularly in our current development projects in the country. But coming to you, Prof, there's a lot that engineers talked about, the exchequer financing, donor support. You're talking about the private and the public, the PPP, but which is the best mode of financing? Because anytime you talk about infrastructure, even you're having this conversation off the cuff, and clearly financing is one of those biggest deals when it comes to infrastructural projects. So which one is the best mode?
Thank you. I don't think as such we should say that which type of financing is the best. I think the main thing is just we're trying to have a mix. The government can only pay so much, or it can only fund so much on infrastructure projects, and the demand is too high. Of course, if the government had all the money it required, the best would be for the government to actually implement all the infrastructural projects, because there's no.
And it will need to borrow or increase taxes for that matter.
Okay, I was saying from the point of view, if they had all the money, otherwise, if they from the taxes they collect, they had enough money to implement the infrastructural projects. The best thing will be for it to just finance infrastructural projects by themselves. But however, that's not the situation we are in. They have to get extra money somewhere. As my colleague has said, they may have to borrow, they may have to get grants. And this the money is not free. You've got to pay for it later on in life. So it's something which you have to do, so you get the benefits today and you pay for it in future. PPP is a form of infrastructure financing that has come up mainly so that we can limit the amount of money the government borrows, or rather than putting so much pressure on the government to borrow. At the same time, this is also increasing the amount of entrepreneurial spirit. So if somebody comes up with a good idea, for example, the university does not have enough hostels, and somebody says, I can put up the hostels for you. All you have to do is, for example, give me the land, or maybe I have the land. And this is happening in Kenya, for example, the Kwetu hostels that are coming up all over the country. This is an example of PPP, whereby somebody has come up with an entrepreneurial idea that he can put up hostels, relieve the university for the money that they need to put up new hostels as they're getting more students, and then collect the money by themselves. So it's a mix. Nowadays you have to have a mix. If you have to tell the government to fund everything, it'll be very expensive for it. And as you say rightly, it'll mean the government will have to tax us very much more. And that has its own political implications. Yeah,
which is one of those things that we would even want to hear at this at this point in time. Yeah. But still staying on that PPP, the public-private partnership, if I've gotten you correctly, so then this means that this is a private entity or a private company coming together with the state or a public organization to see how they can merge together and develop. Is that it?
No, okay, yes and no. It's not necessarily so. But most of the time, since the kind of projects they're dealing with are massive and they involve quite a lot of issues, they have to get the government involved. For example, the example that is put of the Nairobi Expressway. Yeah. I mean, the expressway is on land which is owned by the public, so the government has to allow it to do that. They also have to cushion the private enterprise from things like political risks, so they have to give a guarantee that irrespective of how many years it takes, they will still be able to get their money. So they've got to give those guarantees to them. And then they also got to allow them to work in a conducive environment. Yeah. And then, of course, the PPP also, depending on how it is set up, part of it is also they have to give the government some money on a continuous basis. And normally, the project is such that after a number of years, the assets revert back to the government. So the government gets an asset free of charge. The public are able to use the asset, of course, at a price for some time. And sometimes in the long run, the asset also becomes, the use of the asset has come of age, so now we are applying it immediately. So it's a question. It's a new concept. It never used to be there before. It's a concept. Initially, everybody thought the government should do everything. There's a new concept just come up, and people have money. There's availability of money. The stock exchange. There's availability of money. So you have organizations which have a lot of surplus money, and they want to see where they can put it. What they call private finance. Or financing bodies or equity bodies. So that's how the whole thing came up. Yeah. So it's a new concept. It's catching up. It's relieving the government of the demand for money from them. And so you are also shifting it to the private sector. And they always say that the private sector has got better economies. They're more efficient. They're able to look after things in a better way. So, and maybe get a higher return. So it's amenable to them. Yeah. As you say, it's a win-win situation.
Indeed, it is a win-win situation. And what better way to continue growing our infrastructure if not embracing some of these new forms that, you know, we come across. But coming to you, Engineer, talk to me about the role of infrastructural development in Kenya's economy, because we are a growing economy. And just looking at, you know, what happened perhaps in the previous government, there had been a lot of conversations and coming from various quarters that why is this government focusing on infrastructure? Why are we constructing roads yet we have serious issues, as some would say, basic commodities going high, cost of living is high? Why don't we focus on this and then we can focus on roads later? But why is it important to just develop and grow infrastructure of a country and growing your bases on Kenya particularly?
Yeah, you know, infrastructure basically is a foundation of growing economies globally. If you do not have good infrastructure, then you cannot achieve, let's say, food security, because you can have agricultural production, but without access to the markets, then it's of no good. So what infrastructure does is that it opens up the factors of production. So you've got farmers, for instance, growing their crops. They need to send these crops to the markets. They need inputs to be brought to them. There's a direct correlation also between infrastructure and security. For example, if you look at the Nairobi Isiolo Moyale Road, several years ago, to drive from north of Isiolo towards Moyale was a real adventure that could take you several days. In between, you could be ambushed by marauding thugs, militias. But now you can actually drive from Isiolo to Moyale and back the same day. You don't need any security escort. So it has opened up that area. It has dealt with the security concerns that were there. But most importantly, it has opened up markets. I mean, I'm sure if you look at many places around Kenya, rural Kenya, where there have been no roads and suddenly a new road comes up, opens up the place, you will see a lot of economic activity. In Nairobi here, when the Thika superhighway was built, there was a lot of economic activity that was spurred in that corridor. And if you look at the time wastage, for instance, if you don't have good infrastructure, all that actually goes to affecting the economy in a very negative way. So, I mean, infrastructure, comes in a big way to help the economy to grow. I mean, telecommunications. Yeah. If people cannot communicate, they cannot do business. If there's no telephony, places where there's no telephone network, people cannot even send M-Pesa to one another, so you cannot trade. Mm-hmm. So, there are all these subtle points that we fail to look at, but, generally infrastructure development has a very big and direct correlation with economic development. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then, as you said, in fact, it informs my next point that indeed there's really a direct link between infrastructure and development. But then again, why is that notion around there that people really don't think that that is quite the case? And just from what I said earlier, drawing examples from what really happened even in the previous government, there's a lot of concerns and questions. Address this now. We can look into that later. Is it a question of lack of proper awareness, lack of knowledge and understanding? What would you draw this to?
Yeah, I think to some extent it is lack of proper awareness. And also, the work that engineers do in infrastructure development is not really well appreciated. Mm-hmm. And I think there needs to be more involvement of engineers in policy development. Engineers need to sit at the table where policy decisions are being made, so that we can have input from engineers in terms of the direction to which infrastructure development is taking place. And in terms of communication to the public for the benefits and all that, I'll give you an example. If you look at the Nairobi Expressway, from Westlands to Nairobi JK or Mlolongo, could easily take 2 hours or 3 hours on a bad day before the expressway was built. Mm-hmm. Now it's a 15-minute run. But people really don't see it that way. People never saw it that way. That with this infrastructure, you can actually do your business faster. You can grow the economy faster because you can move from Westlands to Mlolongo quickly, attend a meeting there, or do any other business there, and back to Westlands. So there is an adage that says that you pay for good infrastructure whether you have it or not. So if you don't have that infrastructure, you're paying for it in other ways. There is opportunity cost. So if you're spending 3 hours to drive from Westlands to Mlolongo, sitting in the traffic, you're burning fuel, you're burning time which could be used for more productive activities. So would you rather not, let's say, invest in doing that nice road, even if you have to pay for it directly at 300 shillings, it's cheaper to pay 300 shillings directly to drive from Westlands to Mlolongo than to burn fuel worth more than 300 shillings and burn time more than that 300 shillings. So you pay for good roads or you pay for good infrastructure whether you have it or not. So there's a communication issue here that needs to be communicated to the public, that you need to have, good infrastructure spurs economic development and growth.
Well said. Communication as well as education, because if you're well informed and educated, we wouldn't really be complaining about why we're building houses, why we're building roads, why we're ensuring that we have proper telecommunication. We'd actually understand the importance of that in the long shot. But coming to you, Prof, talk to us about these gaps on an extended version, because we keep saying oftentimes that our problem is not really quite in terms of policy. When you talk about whatever sector, the issue is always in the implementation. So it always looks like there's what we have here in terms of what's on paper, written, and at the end of the day, what is being implemented. So in between, what gaps are we talking about that we want to address? Policy gaps in addressing these issues of infrastructure. What are we talking about?
Thank you. I think, as my colleague has just said, the issue is that sometimes these policies are formulated when the engineer himself is not on the table when the policies are being implemented, and he finds himself basically just implementing what has been agreed or decided somewhere. Just as I mentioned earlier, for example, we feel that the county government should employ more engineers into the establishment. But you might find that the current establishment of the county governments does not really allow the place for that number of engineers to be put in. So they may have problems like buildings collapsing at the county level. There's nobody there. There's not enough engineers to actually supervise the actual construction that's going on in the county. And if we, as the Engineers Board of Kenya, for example, we write to the counties and say that you should employ professional engineers, you should have at least three as a minimum, or 4. But they say the establishment does not allow us. That's not what was decided on the day when the county government was put up. Yeah, so it's the gap there is really, those issues should have come up at the time when the county structure was being established. Such that by the time now the county governments are working, it's easy for these to be implemented. Yeah.
Well said. And I want us to, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that a little bit. Yeah. You know, the thing is, you need to look at the space of engineers in infrastructure development and how this can contribute towards economic transformation.
Okay.
So you've got policies. For instance, if you look at the successive policies or the policies of successive governments.
Engineer, just allow me to cut you short kindly. I will pick it up with you after this break. You have to take a very quick breather.
Sure.
We'll recoil with more on this conversation with my guest. Stay put. Welcome back and thank you for your valued company. You're still on Good Morning Kenya, holding court with my guest to my extreme left. That is Engineer Peter Wanday, who is the former chairman, Association of Consulting Engineers of Kenya. Right next to him, actually at the center now, what you're having, that is Engineer Professor Silvester Abuodha, who is a consulting engineer at the Engineer Board of Kenya. Now, let me just pick it up with you, Engineer. You were responding to that issue of the gaps that exist between the policy and the implementation.
Yes, my colleague just alluded to the involvement of engineers and competent engineers at county level, but I wanted to take that a little bit higher and address the situation at national level. When policies are being made at national level, you know, if you look at infrastructure development, the place of infrastructure development in this country, it takes a significant proportion of the national budget. Look at the budget we have for this financial year, which is over 3.3 trillion shillings.
Yes.
A very good chunk of that will be going towards infrastructure development. But what you find is that there is no involvement of engineers at that high policy level that will oversee the implementation of this budget or of this policy. And if you look at successive governments, we have always had very good national development plans. Even manifestos of the ruling parties. They talk big about infrastructure development and growing the economy from a perspective of enhancing infrastructure development. But when it comes to implementation, how are engineers involved? I think that is one area where there's a serious gap. And just to give you an example, for instance, right now, if you look at the new cabinet that was unveiled, there's not a single engineer. So when the highest policy-making organ, which is a cabinet, sits to look at how to implement the manifesto of the party of Kenya Kwanza and how that integrates within other national development plans. Who is there in that sitting with the technical skills and know-how to guide the other colleagues? So what engineers have been reduced to is they've been brought to the table as part of the menu. But what we are saying is that engineers need to have the rightful place on the table. We need to have our seats at the table where these issues are being discussed and not being reduced to the menu. We don't want to be eaten. We want to contribute. So this is one of the serious gaps that we need to address in this country. And I'm hoping that when the principal secretaries are appointed, we're waiting for that now, and other technocrats, that we'll see a significant number of engineers being involved at those levels. In the outgoing administration, I have to say that in the area of infrastructure development, there was very little involvement of engineers. There were very few principal secretaries in infrastructure development ministries who are competent engineers, who are engineers. There was no CS cabinet secretary who in the infrastructure dockets who was an engineer, and we are hoping that that can change in this new administration so that engineers can play their rightful role in helping this country grow its infrastructure.
But then, don't you think this has just been a conversation over time? Because you've given an example of the previous government, citing this new government. You even talked about the CS nominees. You're not seeing any engineers there. In the list of the 585, shortlisted PSs, I'm not so sure if there's even a third of engineers there. So then moving forward, what can we do? Because it looks like this is the biggest impediment even in the growth of our infrastructure and development altogether. And then it looks like this has just been more of a talk and conversation around it. But then how do we move past just talking about it and ensure that now we put action to the talk?
Yeah, I think, like I said, we really need to involve engineers. I mean, we can borrow from countries that have been there before. Look at countries like South Korea, who have used competent engineers as part of the economic transformation in that country. Look at China, for example. There's a heavy involvement of engineers to drive the infrastructure development agenda in its contribution towards economic transformation. We can borrow the same. We can borrow a leaf from that and do the same. This is what I think we are failing to do. And if you look at some of the key areas that are mentioned in the manifesto of Kenya Kwanza, there is food security, which is a very big thing. The government has talked about ensuring that there's food security in this country. Where is the relation between infrastructure development and food security? If you do not have engineers at that high apex level to bring this, to help break down these things and demonstrate to the policymakers how infrastructure development can be used to attain food security, then you will always have this talk that we are trying to achieve food security, but you're not using infrastructure development, you're not growing infrastructure development to attain that. Manufacturing, building of roads and ICT, you need to have that thought process of how this infrastructure development can contribute to the growth of these sectors. So as you're translating the manifestos into action, as you're breaking them down and rolling them, implementing these policies, there is need to have engineers at the table to help break down these things. And don't tell me that engineers will just be brought in from a technocrat level to advise higher up. We need engineers to sit at that apex level also, so that they can be part of that policy formulation, which will then trickle down to be implemented by the technocrats.
Well said. And I'm really hoping that relevant stakeholders are listening in, into some of these nuggets that you're pushing forth. Prof, important to have engineers on board from the apex, the top, cascading downwards. But again, we also have the issue of locals. And this has been a complaint over time that even when you look at some of these projects that we are putting up as countries, good number of them will say that they only give us the menial jobs. We don't have our very own locals at the top. How big of a challenge has this been to development and growth of our infrastructure?
Thank you. This is a serious challenge actually we are having currently. I think you know that we are producing about 2,000 engineers in the universities every year. And that some of them are finding it quite difficult to get employment in projects. So you find, for example, with the PPP or foreign funded projects, we find that we have a lot of foreign engineers coming into the country. Of course, the Engineering Board of Kenya is trying its best to limit this by putting in certain conditions, but you find that some of these projects come with they're coming with a loan, or they come with conditions which insist that, for example, if the Japanese are funding a project, they'll say they want their engineering companies to actually come and implement it. So you find that quite a lot of projects in this country are going on, and we're having a lot of, quite a number of foreign engineers coming into the country to implement them, whereas we should be having more of our local engineers getting involved. This will also take the form of technological transfer. So there should be a deliberate attempt by the foreign companies or the foreign companies that come to implement projects to provide a technological transfer to the local engineers and make sure that the local engineers are also employed up to a senior level in most of those establishments, so that once one project is implemented, then from then henceforth the local people can take over and start thinking of how they can also be able to implement a similar projects, even if the funding is to come from outside. And this has to be at policy level, so that when these loans are being negotiated, these conditions are actually put in, so that it's put in that we can have at most only maybe 5 engineers coming in, the top people, but the rest should be locals. So this is an area which we have been pushing as the Engineers Board of Kenya to implement it, so that we have more of our young engineers getting employed, more of them getting internship, more of them getting experience and mentored, and more engineers become able to implement much bigger projects. For example, again, as I say, even going for my postgraduate studies was actually a question of transfer of technology. There was a program going on, and part of it was that we must train the local engineers to be able to take over, and part of that was to go for my postgraduate studies abroad. So there should be a deliberate effort in that manner, so that we have all these things happening, so that we develop our base and we increase the experience of the people in Kenya. Yeah.
I hear you, Prof, and well said, but elucidate on that issue just a bit further, because it looks like to be one of those daunting tasks, as you rightly put it. This is perhaps a company coming from, whichever place it could be, Japan, China, and they're bringing even funding to the country. So how easy is it when they're coming with all these restrictive measures that we are coming on board with perhaps this mode of financing, and so we want our top-notch engineers to oversee this project? How easy is it for our very own country to just say that at the end of the day we also have professionals?
Yeah.
How easy is that?
Well, you have to try, and you have to put your foot down, and you have to put pressure.
Because it looks like a big problem right now.
And so we are also, so that's why we are highlighting it, so that the people in authority and the people who are sitting down negotiating these contracts know that this problem exists, and they also put their foot down and say, okay, this is not free money. We are actually going to pay back this money. Much as you are giving it to us, it really is a loan, and we're going to pay it back with interest. What are our interests? So everybody is looking at his interests. You're providing us the money, you're implementing the infrastructure, but us, we want to see our engineers trained so that they become good enough in future. Yeah, so it's at that level, and this is why my colleague Engineer Wanday is saying that you need to have more engineers when you're negotiating. When you're negotiating these loan arrangements with the foreign countries, so that they also highlight and say that this is a very important part of it. Because sometimes maybe somebody is feeling that this is not really a very sensitive area. It feels as long as how much interest rate are we paying, how much money will we pay per month, are we able to cope with that, is the government able to do that? Say, okay, if that is fine, then we are ready to go. But if we have engineers on board, they will insist that part of it is not just the financial issues, but also the manpower training. Becomes part of the negotiations.
Well said.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, infrastructure development is a very major contributor to creation of employment. That is one thing we need to acknowledge. So if you have more local professionals involved in these projects, then what that will do is that more local engineers, more local technicians will be engaged on these projects and will be creating employment. But the moment that you reduce the involvement of locals, then you're having graduate engineers leaving our universities. And my colleague, who is in academia as well, has just mentioned that we are producing 2,000 graduate engineers in this country every year. Some of these graduates are being disillusioned and end up selling scratch cards to eke out a living. Yet, we see very large infrastructure projects in this country which are not able to absorb them because they're being implemented by foreign entities who have got very little concerns about creating employment. Now, at policy level, if you look at for instance, if you look at the Public Procurement Act, there is an issue of local content, which is quite well captured in the Act. 40% of the value of the project must be reserved for local inputs. However, how are those local inputs implemented? We see a situation where local consulting engineers are not involved in these projects, and if you look at how the 40% threshold is achieved, it is perhaps achieved through supply of building materials, cement and steel, logistics such as transport facilities and all that. Now, you will not sweep off these many graduate engineers looking for work by selling more quantities of cement and steel and providing logistical support to these major infrastructure projects. You actually need to engage these young graduates on these projects. The only way to do that is to increase the proportion of these projects that is going towards local professionals. So rather than look at a global proportion and say 40% was spent locally, but spent on areas that are not providing direct employment or training to graduate engineers, let us look at the part of professional inputs as well and say that must meet the local threshold of 40%. That is, if this project must come with foreign funding and foreign players. After all, as my colleague said, all these loans that we are taking to put up these infrastructure projects will be repaid by local taxpayers. This is not free money. It will be repaid. So we must ensure that our taxes are going towards benefiting our own people. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having foreign players, foreign consultants and foreign contractors in this country. I mean, engineering has become, or infrastructure development for that matter, has become a global affair. So there's nothing wrong with having these foreigners playing. But what we are saying is that the rules of the game must be such that there is participation by locals also to an adequate threshold. And 40%, which is there in the Public Procurement Act as a minimum, we still feel it is low. It's low as a threshold, but we're ready to accept that for now and play by that, only if it is being implemented. But is it being implemented? Not very well. So what we are seeing in this country is a big disconnect. On the one hand, you have a big pool of graduate engineers who cannot find employment. On the other extreme end of the spectrum, you have a lot of qualified professional engineers who have worked in this country and helped to develop this country and are reaching a point where they're being pushed out of the periphery. They're being forced into involuntary early retirement because of lack of adequate opportunities. In between, you have policymakers who see no evil and hear no evil and are allowing all these foreign players to come in and play in this space without involving these locals, either the experienced engineers or the graduate engineers who need training and opportunities. And it's a very sad state of affairs. This is something that we need to fix if we are to develop this country and achieve economic transformation.
And you've really addressed quite a raft of issues there. But even as we speak of training, then what more do we need to do to ensure that we actually have proper training and proper capacity building, perhaps even just for the graduate engineers? Because sometimes there's also that perhaps concern of not experienced enough to handle such kind of projects, so then we will bring our foreign expertise into this kind of project. So what do we need to do in terms of training, capacity building, to make them competitive enough in the market to handle some of this infrastructural projects and programs?
You know, training is twofold. There's academic training, which our universities are doing and are doing well. So I will not dwell on that. But once you leave school, then you get into the marketplace. There is a practical training and experience that you need to attain. And this is the area that I'm talking about. We are not going to achieve that practical training for these graduate engineers if we do not have enough opportunities to go around for them. So what we need to do is to ensure that there is enough, as I said before, that there is enough participation of locals on these mega projects so that we can absorb these young graduates. Granted, there are initiatives which are being made. I mean, the Engineers Board of Kenya, for instance, has launched the Graduate Engineers Internship Program, which is a very noble initiative. But as I say, the test of the pudding is in the eating. So whereas the program is it's a noble idea which has been placed out there. If there aren't enough projects that are being rolled out, then where do you place these interns? You can have the idea that you want to train them, but if you don't have the projects, where do you place them? So this is where local content comes in. On these mega projects, we need to see that there is enough local participation so as to provide opportunities for these graduates. At the same time, even on the exchequer-funded projects, one of the biggest problems that we are seeing in this country is this animal called pending bills. This animal called pending bills. And I think there needs to be a policy decision in this country on how to deal with this matter. Projects are being rolled out without adequate budgetary provisions. So what happens then is that engineers are awarded projects, but they're not being paid. So they cannot sustain themselves, and they cannot absorb young graduates and train them. Yeah. Some of the graduate engineers who have been given opportunities on some of these projects, internship opportunities on some of these projects, are not being paid their stipends. I mean, they are accumulating serious arrears. This is because of this problem of pending bills. How do you take a graduate engineer from school, post him to some project in some far-flung place, and not give him his stipends on time? How do you expect them to survive? His mind will not even be on that project. So whereas he's supposed to focus all his attention and energies to learning on that project, he starts having very crazy thoughts, and some of them even just abandon these internship programs and think of other things that they can do. There is a lot of brain drain from engineering into other professions because of this problem of pending bills. So this is also a policy matter that needs to be addressed.
All right, and just being informed that we are sort of like out of time, but I really wouldn't want us to exit this stage without talking about the Vision 2030 blueprint, which is one of those things that you're seeing. Kenya anchored its infrastructural development agenda on that, the Vision 2030 blueprint. This is 14 years later, 8 years shy to getting to that benchmark. From your own point of standing, how far are we in terms of this infrastructural development programs or projects?
Yeah, so Vision 2030, in my view, was a wonderful idea, and they've had good objectives, and they've implemented quite a number of the projects, and I think this has moved the country quite some distance forward, and I think it should be commended. When it started, we didn't think they could achieve so much, but I think they've achieved quite a bit. Yeah. So my view is that they should just continue and make sure that by 2030 they can implement all that they had planned, and then we think of the next step, which we can put on. But Vision 2030 to me was a wonderful idea. Yeah, and it's being implemented, and that's the way to go actually. Yeah.
And you're on the right track.
You're on the right track on that one. I mean, of course, you always have budgetary constraints.
Yes.
And we can't fault anybody for that. Budgetary constraints are budgetary constraints, but as a plan and as a desire and as a way in which we focus our mind where we are to go, it was a wonderful idea. Yeah.
And I mean, there's really quite a lot who could have conversed around these issues. Also, just drawing from what the former Prime Minister talked about, how much we need as a continent per year just to fund our development projects. And the question always underlines it, then how can we get our own source revenues? Really quite a lot you could have talked about with respect to this conversation, but we really have to exit this space for the next conversation. Nonetheless, it's such a cogent discussion. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen, and for affording us the knowledge that you've given us this Wednesday morning.
Thank you, Doreen. And as a parting shot, I would just like to welcome our viewers out there to the Engineers Conference taking place in 2 weeks' time in the lakeside town of Kisumu. The Association of Consulting Engineers will be holding a conference in Kisumu, and a lot of these issues will be on the table. A lot of these issues will be discussed, from infrastructure to blue economy. So I welcome our viewers out there to visit ACEK website, asec.co.ke, and register for this conference taking place from the 26th to the 28th of October in Kisumu. Thank you.
That's in the next 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Well said. And a good place to end it. Again, thank you very much, gentlemen. I have been speaking to Engineer Peter Wanday to my extreme left, who is the former chairman of ACEK, that is Association of Consulting Engineers of Kenya. Right next to him is engineer Professor Silvester Abuodha, consulting engineer Board of Kenya, of course addressing and talking about issues of policy gaps to enhance delivery of infrastructure programs. Good place to end this conversation, but Good Morning Kenya continues after this short break. Stay with us.